The 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council was created in 1894 by a man named He-Dog. He had already gone to school, probably at Carlisle, and he was from Rosebud. And so he spoke English, and he read and he wrote English. And the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre happened just 4 years prior to this. And he didn't want the people to forget that everything that was going on within our treaty territory was illegal. And so the people had to know about the 1868 treaty. So they started this 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council. And rather than, just calling one big meeting in one place, it was really hard at that time. But they would go to visit their relatives on another reservation, Pine Ridge to Rosebud, Rosebud to Lower Brule, Lower Brule to Standing Rock or Cheyenne River, and they would have meetings in people's homes, and they would spend the night and, be taken care of. Because the other part that most people don't know is that during that time, when they created the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council, it was against the law for our people to even talk about the treaty, to speak our language, to have our ceremonies. All of that was forbidden. And if they caught them, then they would arrest them, put them in prison, probably down at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, or send them to Canton, the insane asylum, the Indian insane asylum over by Sioux Falls. And they would do lobotomies. That means they would cut their brains out without any anesthesia. So how many of our people died from those? Because they were either doing a ceremony, they were speaking our language, or they were talking about the 1868 treaty. So it was all had to be underground. Even up to the time in the late 1940s when I was a child and my grandma was teaching me. At that time, I didn't know that, it was illegal or unlawful, or they would kill them. That was the other thing. There's 4 things they would do to them. And so all of our relatives, all of our ancestors from all of the different bands, and it's the bands, it's not the Oceti-Sakowin, it is the Beta-Sakowin. Beta refers to the Tituan. The Tituan are the ones who speak the Lakota language. Lakota means ally. And so my Shoshone friends over there, they would be what I would call Lakota. But they're not Tituan. They're my allies. They're my friends. My friends in Switzerland, I would call them Lakota because they are our allies. They tried to help us. They are not Tituan. I am Tituan. Tituan, Oglala Tituan, Oceti-Sakowin. It means I'm from the Oglala band of the Tituan subnation of the Oceti-Sakowin. And the Oceti-Sakowin is the 7 big nations together. And 2 of them spoke Nakota, 4 of them spoke Dakota. We, Tituan, are the only one who spoke Lakota. Okay, that's a really misconception that misunderstanding a lot of people have. And so they call us Oceti-Sakowin, but we are not. We are Beta-Sakowin. Beta, fire, 7 fires, yes. 7 bands of the Tituan, of the Oceti-Sakowin. Anyway. So, for all those years that they were teaching, they were having meetings about the treaty and trying to pass the information on down. They were all in fear for their lives, in fear of going to prison. All these things they had to fear, but they kept on doing it because it was the truth. The 1868 treaty was the truth. And so they kept on down through the years. And me and my grandma, when she was teaching me, I was just a little kid. These are her telling me about the treaty wasn't like Article 11 says blah, blah, blah. No, she never said that. But she would say, in the treaty it says, you can live any place you want in western South Dakota. That's the Great Sioux Reservation, from the east bank of the Missouri River all the way to the summit of the Bighorn Mountains. And you can hunt all over in there too. That's how she taught me. And that's how I taught my kids. And so when I was a teacher up at Standing Rock, my boys got stopped by a tribal game warden because they were catching fish. And my boys said to him, this is our territory. There's the east bank over there. We can catch as many fish as we want here. And it was true. And that warden said, you're right. According to the treaty, you can. And they said, yes, our mom said. And see, that's how you treat your kids. You teach your kids that way. Show them where the east bank is. Show them, take them, where is the summit of the Bighorn Mountains, you know. Show them where the battle happened, a Custer fight. Because see, that was all illegal, all wrong. That's all of our treaty territory. And that's what she was teaching me before I went to first grade. So that's how many years ago? 69 years ago, because I'm 75, and so I was 6 when I finally went to first grade. I never went to kindergarten. They didn't have kindergarten then. Anyway, so she was the one that taught me about the treaty. But she told me, don't tell people what I teach you. Don't tell anybody. Don't even tell your folks, because then they won't let you stay with me. And so I never did. I didn't know if my parents knew about the treaty. As an adult, I learned that my father did. Yes, my dad, that was her son. He did know about the treaty, and we would have many discussions about it after I was an adult. So in the early 1990s, I started writing editorials for the Rapid City Journal. And lots and lots of my editorials were about the treaty. But I remembered my audience. My audience wasn't just natives. My audience was a whole bunch of white people living in Rapid City in western South Dakota and in parts of Wyoming. And so you have to be diplomatic, I guess is the word. And so I would write about it, but I would write about it in a way like whenever the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, was going to allow a logging in the Black Hills National Forest. And then I would bring in the fact that this is still treaty territory. And the Black Hills National Forest, all those workers pledge an oath to the U.S. Constitution. And that means Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, that they are violating the Constitution. All the federal workers in western South Dakota are violating the U.S. Constitution because they are violating the 1868 treaty. And so, see, those are the kinds of things I would say in my editorials. And, you know, I didn't know if anybody was reading them or if anybody else even knew. I already had learned when I was in my 30s, because by then I was in my 40s, I already had learned while I was in my 30s, and I worked down at Pine Ridge for the tribal government, that most of our people didn't know about the treaty. Most of them didn't. And I felt really bad, but I didn't want to be the big Miss Know-It-All, you know, and so I would never say anything. If I would meet an elder, then I would just ask, you know, what do you know about this Treaty of 1868? And then ask for advice. And sometimes I knew more than they did, but you don't do that. You don't brag. That would be bragging. So you just ask them and then you say thank you, and then you go on. And that's how I met people. And then when I would hear there would be a treaty meeting, as a young woman, I would go and I would take my kids, and they were little, and I would make them sit there and be quiet and listen, because then they would learn too. And I didn't know that, you know, people watch you, but I just, you know, took care of my kids and stayed by myself, and I was divorced. And so, you know, I just did my work and took care of my family. That was my job. But I did know a lot about a lot of things from my grandma teaching me. And so the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council came forward from 1894, all of those years, in secret for many, many years, up until in 1982, then they sent, it was after the Supreme Court decision, because one of the things that they always say is that you need to exhaust all domestic remedies. And our domestic remedies would be in American courts. And that to me is so wrong. No, my grandma always told me, that's the court of the enemy. She never called them the United States, she always called them the enemy. And they were the enemy. They still are. And that's a concept we have to really get to know. Who is our biggest enemy? And unfortunately happens to be the United States. They are trying through their colonization. It's not colonization, it's forced assimilation. Forced assimilation, forcing us to be Americans, forcing American citizenship on us, forcing us. That's colonization. And so, but how she taught me, but I had to keep quiet about it, was they are the enemy. They took away our ceremonies, everything. We didn't have a word for religion in our language. We don't. And so it was a way of life, praying all the time. And I still do that. I have to pray all the time. That's why I have this white paint here. I have to pray all the time. And that white paint is to stop the demons from trying to stop me from speaking and doing the work that now I am assigned to do. 1994, the two men who were sent to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, was Tony Blackfeather and Oglala from Pine Ridge and Garfield Grassrope. In 1982, the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council sent two men to Geneva, Switzerland. There was a meeting of the now I forgot the name of it, but it was specifically dealing with indigenous peoples. They finally had made one specifically for indigenous peoples. The Working Group on Indigenous Populations, that was the name. And by then our people had already exhausted all remedies. And the 1980 Supreme Court decision already came out, where the Congress would have to decide, our enemies would have to decide whether or not they were going to uphold the treaty and give us back all of our land, including the Sacred Black Hills. If you look at a map of the treaty, the Sacred Black Hills are in the center. And is our enemies going to give it back to us? No. No, never, 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 never. And so, but now they had exhausted all remedies in the American courts. And so Tony and Garfield, Tony Blackfeather and Garfield Grassrope were the ones that were assigned to go over there, because they could write, they could speak, they were good. They would be good diplomats for our people. They were personable, they were diplomatic. And so there was a man from England who sent them 2 plane tickets, round-trip plane tickets, from Rapid City to Geneva, go to their meetings, and then come home. So they had their 2 plane tickets, but that was all they had. And so Garfield sold a star quilt, and Tony sold his tractor. And from the little bit that they had together, now this is 1982, they raised $50. And that was for them to be there like a week, and for their food, for their lodging, for anything else that they might need. They had $50. But they were both very spiritual, prayerful people too. And so they got on, on the plane with their $50, and they went to Geneva. But on the way, they had a layover in Paris. It's a long trip. It takes today, it takes a good 22 hours to fly from Rapid City with all the stops you have to make, and then to finally get to Geneva. They didn't know anybody there. There was a layover in Paris, and by the time they got to that layover in Paris, they had to be there for an hour or two, you know. So they went to a restaurant and they ordered coffee. They each had a coffee. And there went $24. The coffees were $12 a piece. So now they had $26 for when they land in Geneva, and they're planning on staying there a week. And so Tony told me these things. That's how come I know. Because he would laugh, and he would say, you know, he would laugh at what they did, but he said we always let the Spirit lead. And so we didn't worry, we would just pray. So when they got to Geneva, then they had to walk. And it's about 8 miles, maybe 5 miles, but I think it's more like 8 miles, from the airport to downtown Geneva. And then from downtown Geneva to the UN is about 5 miles. But they didn't know where to go, what to do. They knew they couldn't get a taxi cab because that would cost too much. So they got their little suitcases and they walked. And they walked to downtown Geneva. And when they got downtown Geneva, then they found a homeless shelter. And so they went to the homeless shelter, and then they found a soup kitchen. And so then they stayed at the homeless shelter, and they ate at the soup kitchen in the evenings. And then they had their few little $26, whatever, and they would, you know, whatever they had to pay. And then they would walk to the UN. I think it's about 5 miles. And they would walk from the homeless shelter up to the UN, the United Nations. And then they didn't know anybody, but this was before. This is 1982. And so you could just go in. And so they did. They just go in, and they're both very personable, ask questions, you know, and they found their way. They found their way to that meeting, the working group on indigenous populations. They met a lot of people, and they did that. That was the first year, and they did the same thing the second year. The same thing the second year. And by the second year then, when more of their friends at the UN found out what was happening to them, then more Europeans that were there started raising money for them or inviting them, you come stay at our home. So they would stay at this home, you know, for a couple days, stay over here for a couple days, and then the families would feed them. And then they would also raise money for them so that when next time they came on that plane and they stopped in Paris, they could buy more than a cup of coffee. They maybe could buy a croissant or something, you know. And so it was the Europeans that helped them get money so that they could keep going. They never would take any tribal money. They never told any of the tribal governments because, see, the tribal governments were formed by the United States by American law, the Wheeler-Howard Act, or the Indian Reorganization Act it's called. And so, no, we're not taking any money from our enemies. We will somehow or other provide for ourselves and do this work for our people because this is wrong. This is wrong, and so that's what they did the first 2 years, and then it was Europeans who helped them so that they could keep coming back. And so they were there when they first started working on the rights of indigenous peoples in 1984. And it was called the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. They made a lot of really good friends, special rapporteurs. These are experts on different avenues, areas, like the one that I met eventually was, although I met a few others, was Miguel Alfonso Martinez. Now, he was a law professor from Cuba, and he was on this working group on indigenous populations. And he wanted to do another one because so many of them would say, we have to have a way to resolve our treaty issues. And he's a lawyer. He thinks treaties. You have treaties? And Tony and Garfield, yes, we have treaties with the United States, and the United States is illegally invading and occupying our treaty territory. And so then Miguel is the one that's pushed him to starting another study just on treaties and agreements between indigenous people and colonizing governments all over the world. Because it's not just in North America, Canada and the United States, it's also in Central America, South America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand. There are many other places where colonizing governments, and primarily English-speaking colonizing governments, went in and either made treaties or made agreements, some kind of an agreement with the indigenous people who already lived there for millions of years. So that's what Miguel Alfonso Martinez did, was he traveled all over the world as a special expert from the United Nations to do this study. And his study came out in 1999. His study on treatments, agreements, and constructive arrangements. If you go to the United Nations website, you can find it. Again, his name is Miguel Alfonso Martinez. He was a special rapporteur. In 1999, the UN, all of them, they accepted his study on treaties and agreements between indigenous populations and colonizing governments. They were still at that time calling us populations. And then eventually it went to peoples. And since I've been going for the last 20 years, I keep pushing nations. Nations, we are nations. You know, we are nations. Every one of us comes from our own indigenous nation. And so that's why my book, it says indigenous nations. It doesn't say indigenous people. It says nations. Because in our case, with the 1868 treaty, it's our nation with another nation, and that other nation happens to be the United States. And we have a treaty with two nations. That's really important because Miguel saw that, and he said these are international treaties, internation, between two nations, not between a nation and a county, or a nation and a city, or a nation and a group of organizations over here. No, these are nations to nations. And so my book, Indigenous Nations, Rights in the Balance, that was why I kept pushing nations. So Tony and Garfield were going from 1982 till 1984. And then, 1994. And in 1994 is when the Working Group on Indigenous Populations sent their report, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They sent it to the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Minorities, because the UN still considered us to be minority people. And the Subcommission approved of it. They approved of that declaration. I call it the original declaration, because this is the one, this original declaration is the only one that all the indigenous representatives there at the UN for over 10 years agreed to. And so then that was passed in 1994 by those two committees. Now it went to the Commission on Human Rights. And remember this name, Commission on Human Rights, because I'm going to bring up the Human Rights Council. They are two separate things. So they brought it to the Commission on Human Rights, and it's real important. They brought that declaration now, the next level, to the Commission on Human Rights, asking for their approval. And what happened was, The English-speaking countries, they call them Kansas, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Canada, anyway, those are all the English-speaking countries. They all said, no, 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 no. There needs to be more debate, as if 10 years wasn't enough. They needed to want to push it off into debates. And they called it the Working Group on the Draft Declaration. And they were calling it a draft. And they pushed it off to this draft declaration. And this is in 1994. Now this is, our Treaty Council has been going now for 100 years. 1894 to 1994. And that's kind of important also. It gives you a perspective of how long our Treaty Council had been working. 100 years, trying to get our treaty resolved. And finally now, the original declaration, Article 36 of the original declaration, if it was passed the way the indigenous people agreed to, we could have gotten our treaty issue resolved. But Article 36, I can come back to that later. I can come back to that if you want me to later. Because what happened next was this. When the US and Canada and Australia and New Zealand wanted to push that off into a working group, then it was like during the, the lunch break. That's a 2-hour lunch break in Europe. Whenever they broke for lunch, because they were still arguing about this in the Commission on Human Rights, then Garfield Grassrope went to the men's room. And while he was in the men's room, he went into a stall. And the stalls have doors. So he's in a stall. And here he hears the American delegation come in. Because when you are in a place like that, at the United Nations, a big meeting like that, and you hear people talking English, I can do it now. You hear people talking English. By their accent, you can tell where they come from. Do they come from England or Great Britain? Do they come from Canada? Do they come from Australia? New Zealand is kind of hard because New Zealand and Australia, they really sound alike. Or they are the American. And you can tell by their accent where they're from when they talk English. And you also could tell if someone talks English, that English is not their first language. You could tell that too. And sometimes you can even pick it up so much that you could tell whether they're from Asia or India is another one, but India has a different accent. Or Russia, or maybe Italy, someplace else. So anyway, he is in this stall. Garfield is in this stall. And he hears this American delegation come in. And he hears them talking because he understands now. He's been there 12 years now. And he hears them talking, and he understands that these are the Americans. And they are talking about him, and they're talking about Tony Blackfeather. And what they say is, we have to push this off into debates because those two Indians from the United States, they're old, they're not educated, and they won't be able to debate. They won't be able to argue with us. And so let's get this pushed off into those debates. And so they're talking that way, and he listens and he hears them. And he stays in the stall and he waits for them to leave. And then they leave, and he hears them leave, and after they leave, then he comes out. And the first thing he does is he goes back to the big meeting room. You see those big meeting rooms, they look like a big U and everybody's sitting on there. He goes back there and he finds where Tony is, and he tells Tony what happened. And then, but when he tells Tony, he says, this is what they said. We're too old and we're too uneducated, and we won't be able to debate with them. We won't be able to argue with the United States. And then Garfield says, but I know someone who can, and you know her too. And they talk. And then Garfield says, it's Charmaine. Charmaine can argue for us. Charmaine, because they have been reading all my editorials all that time. And they know I can argue. I will argue. You know, like I'll argue with the Forest Service. You are wrong to do this logging project, because that's our sacred Black Hills. I'm not afraid to say that. And so then when they come back then in 1994, when they come back from their trip over there, then they call a meeting in Pine Ridge, in Kyle. They called a meeting in Kyle, and then people would come from Rosebud, from Standing Rock, from wherever. They would come, and then Tony and Garfield would give their report, and they had been doing this, you know, for years. And so then they gave their report, and they said, we know someone who can come with us and who can argue, and we want her to come with us, and we want her to be with us. And that was me. I wasn't there. I didn't know any of them, but they all knew who I was from primarily my writing, my editorials, where I argued so hard on behalf of our people and on behalf of the treaty. But that's how I was raised, you know. That's what I was supposed to do. And so then they don't have votes. They just appoint you. That's our old way. She can do this. We want her to come with us. Anybody say no? Nobody said no. Okay, somebody go tell her now. And so that's how eventually, a few years later, I got involved. But I was still writing. I mean, I wrote editorials for the Rapid City Journal for more than 5 years. And then after that, I wrote for the Sioux Falls Argus Leader for a long time. And then Indian Country Today, Lakota Times, you know. But I also was working on a book, my first book, Testimony for the Innocent. And then I would write essays and just all kinds of things I was writing. Not knowing that these guys over here already made a path for me. And then in, I think it's 96 or 97, Garfield passed away. And I never ever got to meet him. Because it wasn't until either 1998 or 1999 when I finally met Tony Blackfeather. And it was at the takeover of the tribal government at Pine Ridge. And then after I met Tony, then he said, we want you, the other ones had come and told me they want you to work with them. And I say, fine, give them my name and my address and my phone number and have them call me and I will go. You know, I will work with them. Yes, I will. I thought they wanted me to be their secretary because I'm a good secretary. I'm organized. I'm a good secretary, although I was trained to be a science teacher. And so it wasn't until 1999 and the takeover of the tribal building at Pine Ridge that I finally met Tony Blackfeather. When I met Tony, it was at the takeover of the tribal building at Pine Ridge. They were going to have a meeting, and so I went. I had been ill, very ill, so I couldn't come right away. But when I finally got there, I walked into the tribal building, and I saw this older man standing there. He had on a plaid shirt. It was summertime, I think. He had on a plaid shirt, but it just went to his elbows. And he had on jeans and cowboy boots, and he had on a baseball cap, and he was reading something up there. And he said, I didn't know what to say, because how I was taught is it's, you know, we're the only two in this room, and you don't go up to them. You don't just say, hey, mister, you know, you don't do that. And so I was standing there wondering, how am I going to find out where the meeting is? Is it still going on, whatever? And I think I cleared my throat. And then he turned around. And when he turned around, he said, I know you. And he was just smiling at me, and I don't know who you are. And then he said, I'm Tony Blackfeather. And this, it's been hard for me to say that because I always remember. I mean, and we became really good friends. And during the time when he was still alive, he died in 2004. Then we went to Geneva, we went to New York. We did a lot of meetings, and he taught me a lot of things. He introduced me to all his friends and everything at the UN in Geneva, Switzerland. He was already by that time staying with the family. So when we got there, they had prepared a room for me too. So he already had set the path, and I just thought I was going to just be the secretary. And we went, and I met all these people. I, did all these things, gave speeches. He would, okay, tomorrow you need to talk about the environment in the treaty territory. You have 5 minutes. That kind of thing. I'd go back to my room, and I would be, my eyes, I would just think, oh my God, stay awake half the night. What am I going to say, and everything. And anyway, he was also my relative. Tony was my relative. We both had the same great-great-grandparents and anyway, we were cousins. And then later I found out that Garfield Grassrope was also related to me, and so through the Whiteface side. And so these two guys were they were my cousins. We traced it down, so whether they were my uncles or my cousins, they were my cousins. And so then when Tony got sick in 2003, December of 2003, then I had to go by myself. I was waiting at the airport for him, and here he said, he called me and he said, I can't come, you have to go by yourself, but you know what to do. And so I cried all the way over there, all the way over to Geneva. Just cried and cried and cried, because I felt so alone and not prepared. How am I going to do this? I can't handle this by myself, that kind of thing. But he always told me, let the Spirit lead. And so as soon as I got there, I did everything that we always did. First thing, when we would get there to the UN, there was a tree we went to. We would put out tobacco and we would pray. First thing, every time. And then in the evenings, before we left, we would go by the tree, put out tobacco and say, thank you, Wopina. And so then I prayed and I said, let me do whatever you want me to do. All of you want me to do. Let the words come. Let me be able to do whatever it is you want me to do. And that's what I still do today. Every day to this day. And so then he died in August of 2004. And it was at the wake that Clifford White Eyes came up to me and told me, now you take over. Here I was in major grief. My cousin, my good friend, because we would talk every day the last couple of years of his life. We would talk on the phone and about what's going on in Geneva. What do we need to do? What could I write? Or would I look this up or whatever? And so here I am in major grief, and then they tell me, you are the ones that they chose in 1994 to take over when Garfield and Tony could no longer go. And so now you are the spokesperson. And so now you have to continue with the work at the UN. And the reason why the work at the UN is because where else can we go? We need the help of the family of nations. And yes, the United Nations is an exclusive club. And yes, it was started, and many of them are colonizing governments. Not just the English-speaking ones. Remember, Spain was a colonizer. Portugal was a colonizer. France was a colonizer. So it's difficult, but we have no other place to go. And Article 36 in the original declaration was what gave us a way to get our treaty resolved. And that's why, that's why they kept going, and they saw by working on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that there were others that were in the same boat. Other countries, other nations throughout the world were in the same boat that we are. And so Article 36 in the original declaration was what, when Tony was dying and I would go see him and I would ask for, what else? What are my orders? What do you want me to do? And one of the things he says was, Article 36 has to be pushed. Article 36. And I'm going to read it to you because there's a lot of people have had arguments. We had arguments about this. And this is what it says. This is from the original subcommission text. It says, Indigenous people have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors according to their original spirit and intent, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. But the enforcement word, that's the power word. The second part of this, there's only 2 sentences in the original Article 36. The second sentence, conflicts and disputes which cannot otherwise be settled should be submitted to competent international bodies agreed to by all parties concerned. We had arguments with other indigenous nations about this second sentence, and we said no. We have to have whoever would help us to settle these be agreed to by all parties concerned. And for us, we have to be this way because in our culture, we cannot impose our will on anybody else. It would be like if the United States would say, only Canada can settle this, or only one of their friends can settle this for us. No. And if we were to say, okay, only China can settle this for us. You see, and then the United States would say, no, China's our enemy. And then we could say, no, Canada's our enemy. Canada has that goofy line that separates us from our relatives that live up in Canada who were originally there in the first place. They didn't travel up there. They were already originally settled there. But the Canada wanted them out, so they said they came from the United States. No, Canada is not our friend. And so that's why we had to have that in there, agreed to by all parties concerned. In our culture, you do not impose your will on anybody else, nor do you want anybody else to impose their will on you. And so after we would explain that to the other indigenous, they would say, yes, we agree. It's the same way in our cultures too. And so the important words were the enforcement of treaties and agreed to by all parties involved, and a competent international body. A competent international body could be the International Court of Justice that's in The Hague. That's the one that the Europeans use. White people always use The Hague to settle things like war crimes. They're going to be where they want to take Russia and Ukraine and have them settle their dispute, is to The Hague. Well, what if we don't want to go to The Hague? What if we want to go to the Organization of American States International Court of Justice, which is only for the Western Hemisphere? You see? And so, a competent international body, that's why it doesn't say it in there, you have to go here or you have to go there. It has to be a place agreed to by all parties involved. for the enforcement of that treaty. And enforcement is the word that is the action word. You can say honor all you want, but that doesn't mean you're going to enforce it. Oh yes, I honor your treaty. That's what the United States says. But we're not going to enforce it. Because if they would have to enforce it, what would that mean? All the people that live in western South Dakota and in parts of North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Nebraska within our treaty territory would all have to leave. Because the only ones that could say people are here are us, the people of the Sioux Nation. And so the U.S. is not going to enforce it. No, they're not going to. They could say they honor it all they want, but they're not going to enforce it. And that's in violation of their own U.S. Constitution, Article 6. They violate their own U.S. Constitution, Article 6, which says treaties are the supreme law of the land. Plus, they violate the March 3rd Act of 1871. The March 3rd Act of 1871 that was established, that was Congress ratified that 4 years after the 1868 treaty was passed. And in the March 3rd Act of 1871 it says treaties made before this date will not be changed or ratified. And so that means the 68 treaty has to be enforced, even according to that American law. And yet the United States refuses to do this. So these were things that, you know, like we would sit around and we would talk about, and if we were having a report we had to send in to some committee or whatever, we would say, okay, well, let's put in this part or whatever, you know. That's how we would have our discussions. Tony told me the reason why they all, when I first met him, and he said, I know you, you know, and he was smiling at me. He said, I have your pictures and your writing posted up all over in my house. And I don't know who this man is, you know. Whoa, a stalker? And then after he said, I'm Tony Blackfeather, I said, oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. And I did go to his house. And sure enough, he did. He had my editorials that I was writing about the treaty. One of my editorials was titled, It's Still Stolen Land. This is way back in the 1990s, the early 90s. My editorial in the Rapid City Journal, the title of it was, It's Still Stolen Land. And it was hanging up there on his wall. Hanging up there. Many of my editorials were hanging up on his wall. And he said, that's how we knew you knew about the treaty. You were educated, but you knew about the treaty. And we already knew what you already did fighting for the people when you were the treasurer and everything else working for the tribe. And we knew you. We knew who you were. And so it was easy when Garfield said, we want Charmaine. It was easy because we already knew. You know we come from a sovereign nation. You know we are a separate nation than the United States. And yet you're educated in the American system. And you're a scientist. And he said, so no, you didn't forget who you were. And I said, no. My grandma taught me who I was when I was growing up, before I went to first grade. So I already knew who I was. And she told me I would never forget. And she also told me someday you will be writing words on paper to fight for our people. And so that's what I've been doing all these years. So now to today. Just this morning, I got an email from the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And they asked me, do we want our report that we sent to them put on their website? And our report contains an 8-page report about the United States, how it commits racist actions against us, and about how this can all be resolved if our treaty was enforced, and recommending to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that in their recommendations to the General Assembly, that we, the Great Sioux Nation, be put in the decolonization processes of the United Nations. And that means they recognize us as a nation with a legitimate international treaty with the United States. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. And it's at least, I'm going to ask for at least 10 years. 10 years to do this. Because look how long they've been here. Over 150 years they have colonized our people. So we need to be able to go through this process of decolonization. And that's what the United Nations will do. They will send people out here to help us to do this, to remember who we were, to remember who we are as a nation, to help us in all ways that we need help to be the nation the Creator made us to be. That's what this decolonization process is. So, the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination asked if it would be all right for our report to be on their website. Our report is our 8-page written report, plus the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, plus a map of the treaty territory, plus the most recent article from Voice of America, which is a U.S. government-backed newspaper and radio station that talked about the most recent racism here in Rapid City and in western South Dakota. Within the report are also other sites for them to go to look at other things, other reports, like from the Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. That's a big long report, like 62 pages. I wasn't going to send that to them. So these things are in our report, and now probably already it is on the website for the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, with our strong recommendation that they send us through the United Nations decolonization processes. And I always add in there, we need the help of the family of nations. We have this legitimate treaty with the United States, but we are so small now that before it's too late, we need your help to survive as a nation. Otherwise, it's called genocide. Not just cultural genocide, actual physical genocide. So that's one of the things, that's the most recent thing I've been working on. In May I sent a report to the Advisory Committee for the Human Rights Council. And again, this one was talking about the environment and the most recent technological things they want to do to the atmosphere and to the earth to try to stop this climate change. And so I gave them an example of what someone did to the atmosphere in 1972, when they had the Rapid City flood. They had seeded the clouds in the Black Hills and caused a 500-year flood that took out 238 lives. And now they want to seed the atmosphere with other things. And so I said, no. Because they don't have the spiritual understanding we have about what is the atmosphere. What are the thunderclouds? Who are the thunderclouds? They don't have that spiritual understanding that you can talk to them. They are beings. We can talk to them. We can ask them, go around us. Or, come, we need rain. We can do that. But they don't have that spiritual understanding of that. Nobody. Indigenous do, but not the United States, not the Canadian government, not a lot of these big, powerful governments that are at the UN. And so in my report, and again, that one, you can find it at the Advisory Committee to the UN Human Rights Council. Now, if you remember before, I said there's a difference. There was the Commission on Human Rights, and then now there is the Human Rights Council. Okay? So when the UN, after Tony had already died, and I'm still going to the debates, and now I'm bringing 2 other men with me, one from Rosebud, one from Pine Ridge, to come with me to the UN so that they can witness everything I say and do. And then the UN was going to, and they did, they were going to throw out the declaration that was approved by all the indigenous people. And they were going to put in different kind of wording for that Article 36, so we would have no place to go to for the resolution of our treaty. They were going to do this. And so then I got a call from some other indigenous people, and they asked me, would I participate in a hunger strike? Because they were, on the last time that all the indigenous and the UN representatives were going to meet in Geneva in December of 2006, they wanted to have a hunger strike to make sure that the original text would go on to the General Assembly. And so I told them, I said, I can't do a hunger strike, but I can do a prayer fast. I will pray. I can do a prayer fast and I can pray. And I will do that. And so there were 6 of us that did this. I did the prayer fast and hunger strike. The other 5 did a hunger strike. I did the prayer fast. They did the hunger strike. Okay. And the Commission on Human Rights, that was the next one that it had to go to. And so in order to stop this hunger strike and prayer fast, we had meetings with representatives from the Commission on Human Rights. And it was the vice chairman of the Commission on Human Rights that they sent to us to meet with us. And so we did. And we told him, this chairperson for these debates wants to submit his own declaration, not the one that was approved by indigenous people, his own. He is appointed by the government of Chile to be this chairperson. He is not indigenous, and he wants to do this. And so we are saying no, no. The only one that can be sent, the only one that has been approved by both parties, the United Nations and all the indigenous representatives, is the original declaration that was approved by the Working Group on Indigenous Populations and by the Subcommission on the Protection and Promotion of Minorities. That's the only already been approved by 2. And I said, and that's the only one that should be sent to the Commission on Human Rights. And so the Vice President said, yes, that is the only one that the Commission will accept, is the original declaration. Now will you finish your prayer fast and will you finish your hunger strike? And so we said yes, if that is what will happen. And they said yes. And so I ended my prayer fast after 4 days. They ended their hunger strike after 4 days. What happened in between? They abolished the commission. The Commission on Human Rights was abolished. And they put into place the Human Rights Council, who knew nothing about what had happened all the years before, who knew nothing about what happened with all the indigenous nations, all the 20, 30, 40 years before. They knew nothing. This new Human Rights Council. And what was one of the first things they do? They try to approve the chairman's text, not the original one. But the African Union was there. The African Union said, we want to make changes to this. Now, the African Union is made up of all of the different countries in Africa. Some of them are indigenous, majority, but some of them are not. A lot of them are colonized. Just like, say, if all the IRA governments were to make a decision for all of us. You know, all the IRA governments make a decision. That's what happened. And so then they put it off for a year, the voting for a year, that they were going to put off the voting for a year before they send it to the General Assembly. And the next year when it came back, they approved of it. This is the chairman's text, not the indigenous text, the chairman's text they approved. And the bad part, the sad part for me, is that some of those people that participated in the hunger strike from the International Indian Treaty Council turned their backs on what we had done and joined to approve of that wrong declaration. They joined them. The International Indian Treaty Council joined them to approve of that bad declaration. And they said, yes, Indigenous people give approval. No, Indigenous people did not give approval to that chairman's text. And no, we had turncoats within those that were participating in the hunger strike. I know, I was there. I prayed for 4 days, sitting in the back of the room while the meeting is going on. I know what happened. And so then, quickly, I wrote letters to every single member of that General Assembly. From the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council, we sent letters to the General Assembly, and we told them this exact same thing what I'm telling you now. Do not approve of that declaration, because that's not the one that was approved by Indigenous nations. No, do not approve of it. But they did anyway. And so that's when I said, okay, fine. And I wrote this book. I wrote this book so all Indigenous people all over the world can know the truth of the matter. The UN betrayed us, but we have no other place to go. And the UN took out Article 36. They put in their own version, whatever it is. It's in here. It's in this book. And if you want a copy, just let me know and I'll send you one. The money that we raised from the sale of this book goes to the work of the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council. And now it's being published in Spanish. And again, just this morning, more news. This Italian student translated it into Italian, and so now we need a publisher that can publish it in Italian, and they will hand it out all over Italy. So slowly, the world is getting to know about the betrayal of Indigenous people at the UN, but we have no other place to go. And now it seems as if we have better friends. In 2007, the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council, we went to the CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We handed out a report. And Russia was our friend at that meeting. Russia questioned the United States. They said, how do you unilaterally, one-sided, change the treaty? The United States never, ever answered them. Never. And that was a question we had given to all of the members of the committee. And after it was over with, I went up to the Russian delegate and I shook his hand and I said, thank you very much for presenting that question. That is who we are. We are the Sioux Nation, and that's where I come from. Middle of the United States, middle of North America. That's who I am. And he smiled at me and he said, we know who you are. We know more about you than probably the whole United States does, but we know who you are. And he said, yes, thank you for raising that question, because that's a question that affects everybody, not just us, but that's their history. And so now our friend seems to be from China. Last October, China passed a resolution in this new Human Rights Council that says decolonization needs to happen for Indigenous nations. And so we have another friend. And so that's why I am pushing these things now, and I will be pushing more committees to uphold Article 48.7, which was passed on October 8th at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, that says Indigenous nations need to be decolonized. And that's us, and that's many, many other Indigenous nations all over the world. And so we have been really, really busy for the last 40 years, the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council. We have been real busy telling our plight to the world, telling our situation every place we can to the world, and telling everybody in the world that the United States has an international treaty with us that they refuse to enforce. And that if they don't enforce it soon, this is called genocide. When we are gone, when I'm gone, I don't know how many others are left that knows our whole history and knows everything we did. You know, it's called genocide, physical genocide, not just cultural genocide, but physical genocide. And so, yeah, we have done a lot of work at the United Nations level, over 40 years. And I've been doing this over 20 years. Because I was writing, the first time I went to the UN was at the first meeting of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. That was my first meeting at there, but I was writing way before that. And so for 20 years now I've been writing stuff. Now I've been writing stuff since then for the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council. I have so many things. Volumes. My advice for those who say they are going to the UN is that I know the truth. I know the facts, and the UN knows the facts. The first two were Tony Blackfeather and Garfield Grassroot from the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council. And I have followed since then with others, Clifford White Eyes, Garfield Grassroot, Garvard Goodplume, different ones that have gone with me to witness what we do at the UN. It's not easy. I've been there probably 30, 35 times. In Europe, in Geneva, that's how many meetings I've gone to. I know within one 5-year period during the debates, I went 3 times a year. And it costs money. And we raise our own money, you know, through our friends, through foundations. We don't take any tribal money. No, we don't take the sale of my books. You know, that's how we raise money, different ways like that. There are foundations and everything in Europe who also help us. But those who say this, I never saw them there at the meetings. I never saw them. And that was one of the reasons why Tony wanted to introduce me to everybody, to keep the continuity. And if they really want to know about all of our work, it's real simple. One of the most easiest ways is to just get this book, because I tell a lot in here about how I became the spokesperson, about what the 1894 Treaty Council has been doing all these years. I know there's many of our men, my own relatives, friends from my own tribe, who have fought really hard against me because I'm a woman. When that happens, I feel bad, because I know that's a colonization. In our culture, if they really knew our old culture and our old ways, they would know that we were matrilineal. We were matrilineal. That means that our old grandmas, our women, were the leaders. It's matrilineal. And the Katela Society, the War Club Society, was the ones. They were the main ones. And they could take their war club into any meeting and say, I wish to speak. And they would be given the respect, because then they were the spokesperson. And now that's what I am. I am Katela. I am the spokesperson for the 1894 Sioux Nation Treaty Council. This is all within our culture. It is within who we are as a nation. I feel bad. If they don't, they could go to our website. We have a website, www.SiouxNationTreatyCouncil.org. A lot of my writing is on there. A lot of the reports and stuff that we have had to send to the UN are on there. This most recent report we sent to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is on there. The history is on there. There's even a picture of He-Dog on there from 1894. Or if they just want to email me, call me. I will be glad to talk to anybody. I just have to wear my mask.
That's an
hour and a half.
That's good, Grandma. That's really,
That's
really,
good.
really
Informative.
good.
Lots of information.